Please be seated. I bet we see him cruising across the balcony. I'm going to watch. So if I start preaching like this, I just want to see if the kids are... I mean, where did they go? Anyway. We're all getting used to worshiping here at St. Paul's for this liturgy because Trinity Church is undergoing a rejuvenation. And so they always went a certain way before, and now it's changed. Our kids who go before. See, here they are. All right. We thought we'd be coming through the balcony. Okay. So we're doing a lot of things differently. And sometimes church is to help us sort of get back to our touchstone. And rituals are often repetitive to help us do that. And we've just changed all our rituals, so hang in there. If you're having a hard time finding your plumb line because we've switched from Trinity to St. Paul's, I think there are others who may join you. And the good news is this: you'll just figure out how to find your plumb line here, and then we'll move back. And then we'll be thrown off again. So it's a bit like life, isn't it? Right when we get settled, right when we find our groove, something changes. I'm thinking this morning about Abraham and Sarah. At this time in their lives, they were in what is now modern Iraq, Ur in their time. Even names change. Same place, different name. And they were in the tent where they lived. And Abraham looked out and saw 3 people coming towards them. And he ran into Sarah and said, God is coming, we have to get ready. Whatever possessed Abraham to see God in 3 people? But the voice of God came to them in that way. And they said what we heard today. Abraham and Sarah together said, "Here I am." That's one of the repetitions that Abraham makes. I frankly think Sarah's more faithful than Abraham, but I can't really argue that in the pulpit, so ask me later. I think Sarah's the paragon of faith. Abraham was a bit of a wimp, but anyways, together they were strong. And we put the words in Abraham's mouth, "Here I am." It is the statement of faith, a statement of response to God's voice, even when God comes to us in the image of 3 strangers in the desert. And the first thing Abraham and Sarah did, so one of the reasons I love Sarah is the first thing she did was laugh. Because it was crazy. Why would God come that way? She had this sense of God's joy and the irony of being in relationship with God. If you read the hymn while you just sang it, it was telling us that the entire universe is singing God's praises. And we're surrounded by this beautiful demonstration. First the sun during the day, and then the moon by night, and the stars, all of them singing God's praises. And there are certain geniuses like Sarah and Abraham who can hear that song and can join in. When you think of Isaiah and the reading we just heard this morning, this incredible passage that is read in many, many different places. Isaiah, he has an experience of the heavens opening. And that's actually the song we're going to sing. I brought the bulletin up here to show you where it is. Where is it? It's on page 14. When the heavens opened, and Isaiah saw that and had that experience, that vision, this is the song the angels were singing. Isaiah heard it and he wrote it down. Some guy, how is it 3,000 years ago? 3,000 years ago had a vision. And we're still singing the words he had in the vision. And it's about God and about God's call and God's power. So what does Isaiah say when he has this vision that still echoes through the ages? He says, "Here I am, Lord, send me." But you'll notice if we go back to Isaiah, it's on page 7. The pivots on the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, "Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips." It's fascinating how this is often the experience people have right before they hear God's voice. Right before they hear God's voice. The next line, "Yet my eyes have seen the Lord, the King, the Lord of hosts." Right before we encounter God, often we're in a place that's filled with smoke. It's at the times that we least expect it. 3 people walking towards your tent in the desert. You're not expecting company in the desert. That's when God surprises us. And it's often when our own souls feel like they're filled with smoke. I've asked you this before, but have you ever been in a house or an apartment where you try to light a fire and you get a downdraft in the chimney and all the smoke comes in? It's horrible. Everything stops. You run and open all the windows, and someone thinks someone else was an idiot, and and so it stops everything. So when you think of your soul being filled with smoke, it's not just feeling a little off balance. This is when you're snake belly low, when everything stops and you realize, I really need to push myself towards a new way. And I hope you all have that experience from time to time. I hope life isn't so comfortable that you don't allow the house of your soul to fill with smoke. It's that openness, it's that downdraft that opens us and I think lets our eyes and ears become available to seeing and hearing God's Spirit. And they usually come in surprises, don't they? They usually come in voices or images that we're not looking for. That's where I see Nicodemus this morning in the gospel. Nicodemus was in the in crowd. He was one of the power folks in his time, and he was used to a certain vocabulary. He was used to a certain form of rituals that reinforced that power, and he participated in those rituals. So what was it in Nicodemus? You might wonder, how did his soul fill with smoke right before he heard Jesus? Because he's not the type who would be looking for an alternative. He had risen to the top. He was at the upper crust of his time. He had attained. He was there. He did not need anything new. He just needed to keep it going, because it's really good for Nicodemus. What happened in his soul that opened his heart? It doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us. But we do know, it was a little dangerous for him. He had to sneak at night to go find Jesus and to ask him. And Jesus wasn't overjoyed either, was he? He wasn't like, "Oh, geez, I finally got one of the big guys and I can flip him here." He roughed him up. I mean, the social status we're talking about is a Mediterranean peasant, Jesus, whose family and neighbors worried about food for the day, and Nicodemus, who was upper crust. But the conversation doesn't sound like that, does it? What was it in Nicodemus that opened his eyes, opened his ears, and helped him get out of his rut into something completely new? And what is it in you that does the same thing for you? How do you allow yourself to get off balance in a godly way, not self-destructive and blame it on God? How do you let yourself become off balance like Nicodemus so you can hear God's voice, so that you can hear Jesus' voice in the people around you. Today we celebrate the Trinity, that God is one and three at the same time, which means we can never make God stable. We can never put God somewhere and keep God there. God is always in conversation with God's own self. You could even say with the Trinity, God is a community of love. God is a community of love that is singing love to itself. And prayer is listening to that song in the voices and sounds that we hear. Imagine that God is this community, in a community of love, that God the Creator is singing to God the Redeemer, is singing to God the Spirit, and they're singing to each other. And our prayer is an attempt to hear that song in the voices around us. So Nicodemus heard that prayerful love song in Jesus' words. Where do you hear that song of love? Where do you hear it in your life? Where do you hear God's voice? And where do you become dissatisfied? Most of us have habits of dissatisfaction. We're habitual people. So we have habits of joy. We have habits of reconnection. We have habits of dissatisfaction. What are your habits of dissatisfaction? And have you ever thought that those are not burdens, but doors opening to you spiritually? And that God is leading you there because that's where the smoke is rising, and that's where God's voice is speaking to you. And that's where God is waiting to hear you say, "Here I am, Lord, send me." I was talking earlier with the kids this morning. They meet right here on a rug and we sit and talk. I was telling them that often God's voice surprises us. But I want to say exactly opposite to you. I want to say that God's voice comes to you in predictable ways. And that if you're like me, you'll disregard a lot of those ways because those are not the ways. Those are sort of habits of dissatisfaction. Those are places where you're not looking for God. So I pray today that you look in those very places that are smoky, that are obscured, that take you down, not up, and that you use Nicodemus or Sarah or Isaiah or Abraham as your guide to listen and hear the voice of God where before you would only hear dissatisfaction. Open that door. It's available to you. It's ready, and God is waiting there. Amen.